Hello and welcome to the 60th edition of the GreenWave podcast by Synergy International. I'm SYNI, your host, and today's topic is the Winter Olympic Games and the sustainability paradox baked into every medal, every lift ticket, and every tear shed over a dramatic ice dancing performance. The big question for the pod today is simple and slightly inconvenient. Can a Winter Olympics ever become net positive for nature once the crowds leave? Or does sustainability remain a branding layer laid over a very expensive tourism stampede? And why aren't these issues addressed by the Winter Games in a way that engages winter sport enthusiasts who tend to be much more aware of the importance of preserving our winter environment? The Winter Games sell a specific kind of magic: clean, cold air, snow that squeaks underfoot, mountains that look eternal, ice that behaves like physics in a lab. Then reality walks in wearing muddy boots. Winter is warming. Snow is more volatile. Glaciers retreat. Rain shows up at altitudes that once felt immune. The organisers need to make snow to ensure there is enough on pistes for the ski races. So, the event that depends on winter becomes a high-profile reminder that winter now needs engineering support. That is the fundamental irony, and it gets sharper this year because the Milano-Cortina edition of the Winter Olympics going on now places a big share of the mountain narrative in and around the Dolomites, including Cortina d'Ampezzo. You do not need a sustainability degree to grasp what is at stake. The Dolomites are a UNESCO World Heritage serial site, absolutely stunning as one of nature's most dramatic mountain range. They are also one of Europe's most intensively used mountain landscapes, with villages and ski areas that carry real economic life, plus roads and lifts and hotels that can turn fragile valleys into pipelines for visitors. Let's start with a look at the organisers. The modern Olympic movement has a sustainability playbook. On paper, the direction has improved compared with the old days of pouring concrete like it was an Olympic sport. You see more reuse of venues, more temporary structures, more talk of low-carbon transport, and more insistence on measuring footprints and legacy outcomes. Milano-Cortina has leaned heavily into the reuse narrative because the geography is dispersed. The concept is that spreading events across existing sites reduces the need for new builds. And yes, reuse helps like a recycling play, yet it does not solve the largest emissions driver, which is mobility, which means travel for fans, teams, media, suppliers, sponsors, and contractors. The Olympic circus is not just a metaphor, it is a logistics diagram. Even with trains and shuttles and traffic restrictions, the carbon profile of millions of trips remains the dominant factor. The best design decision is still to avoid travel, which is a strange recommendation for an event whose business model is travel. The evidence also shows organisers lean into what they can control. They talk about renewable electricity powering venues, fewer cars than prior editions through rail and shuttle plans. They make claims about circularity, recycling, waste plans and procurement rules, things like certifications for new and renovated buildings, with frameworks like LEED for building performance and broader infrastructure rating protocols used on certain projects. That is the glossy side, which somehow still remains buried for most casual Winter Olympic fans. Now, to the gritty side, the part that makes sustainability professionals reach for a pencil and start circling assumptions. Snow is the headline problem, and it is no longer a future problem. It is now. Natural snow still falls in the Alps, sometimes in huge dumps that make for dramatic drone shots and cheerful mayors. Yet, reliability and timing have changed. Mild early season periods, rain on snow events, midwinter thaws, and late season volatility complicate planning. For organisers, volatility is a huge risk register item with a price tag. So now the Games rely on technical snow as an insurance policy, made by snow guns fed by reservoirs and pumping stations, shaped by groomers and sensors, and maintained like a high-value surface rather than a natural blanket. Technical snow is denser and more durable, which athletes like because it is consistent and safer at high speeds. Consistency is also what broadcasters and schedule planners like. Nature rarely offers consistency on demand, so machines fill the gap. The sustainability question is the cost of that gap. Snowmaking has two obvious inputs: energy and water. If the energy is renewable, the carbon claim improves. If the water is managed carefully, the ecological claim improves. The catch is that water is a complex system in a mountain valley, which incorporates habitat and a river temperature. Water is key for seasonal availability for communities, and farms downstream also a highly political issue. Reservoirs built for snowmaking become permanent features in sensitive alpine terrain. Water withdrawals can stress local catchments, especially in warm or dry stretches when natural snow is already limited. The simple narrative is that the water returns in spring melt. The complex reality is that timing and location matter. You can return water to a watershed while still stressing specific streams, wetlands, and riparian zones during critical periods. The organisers can respond with better technology: automated guns that fire only in optimal humidity and temperature windows, sensors that minimise overproduction, storage and pumping designed to reduce waste. Those are real improvements, and they should be acknowledged, yet they do not remove the underlying dependence. The Winter Olympics now run partly on a manufactured winter. That is the bit that happens away from the cameras. Now take that manufactured winter and place it in a UNESCO landscape. The Dolomites have a governance structure that exists precisely because the site is a serial property spread across multiple provinces and regions. There is an overarching management strategy, and the conservation outlook assessments have been clear for years about what threatens the site. Climate change is the biggest threat in the long run, especially for glaciers and permafrost, and the aesthetics of ice that tourists and athletes romanticize. Tourism infrastructure and concentrated visitor pressure are the biggest threats in the short and medium term, particularly where expansion and new construction nibble away at intact areas and create cumulative impacts. Cumulative impacts are the long-term story. One new road, new cable, new venue, all seem manageable. Then you sum them across valleys, across seasons, across decades, and the landscape starts to look less like a protected wonder and more like a heavily optimized recreation machine. Cortina d'Ampezzo is the tourism jewel of the Dolomites, sitting inside that tension. The town is iconic, wealthy by any mountain resort standards, and already used to hosting big events. The surrounding valleys carry protected areas and strict planning constraints in many zones. Yet the Olympics introduce a deadline that changes decision-making. Deadlines have a special power over environmental caution and make a compromise feel inevitable. The controversial example is sliding sports infrastructure, where talking bobsleigh, luge, skeleton, these venues are expensive, specialised, and historically prone to becoming white elephants because maintenance is high and post-games usage is limited. The sustainability argument for using existing tracks in other countries is straightforward. If you have a track in reasonable distance, let's use it. The counter-argument is prestige, national pride, and the promise of a local legacy. All those spandex uniforms and high-charging sprint starts come with a heavy environmental price tag. When a new track or major rebuild goes ahead, you encounter land disturbance, construction emissions, material flows, and local ecological fragmentation. You also experience a long operational tail. Refrigeration systems consume energy. Even with renewable electricity contracts, the grid still carries marginal impacts, and the refrigeration has embodied emissions and refrigerant leakage risks over time if not managed perfectly. The broader venue story is more mixed. Some facilities are renovated rather than built new. Renovations can reduce embodied carbon compared with new builds, and if they improve energy performance and serve community use after the Games, that is a legitimate legacy. The key word is after. The Winter Games last a couple of weeks. The legacy lasts decades. Sustainability must be judged on the decades, not the fortnight. So, what is the status of conservation in the Dolomites? In governance terms, the Dolomites are not unmanaged wilderness. They are a protected landscape with coordinated oversight, plus a thick layer of provincial and municipal planning, park regulations, and European conservation instruments in and around the region. The system has real strengths, including monitoring and coordinated management across component sites. The system also faces the classic Alpine challenge. The economic engine is tourism, and tourism loves growth. Alpine over-tourism looks like traffic congestion in narrow valleys, air quality spikes from idling engines, noise, trail erosion, litter, disturbance to wildlife, pressure on water systems, and a rising demand for accommodation and second homes that changes the social fabric of towns. Add climate volatility and the pressure intensifies because operators try to compensate for shorter natural seasons with more infrastructure and more snowmaking capacity. Now let's address the white elephant in the room, snowfall, specifically the last 5 years. The responsible way to describe it is variability with a warming background trend. You see seasons with early scarcity, then heavy late snow, rain on snow events that reduce snowpack stability and water retention, and more mild spells that push the snowline upward. Even when total seasonal snowfall looks decent on paper, the timing and temperature profile can still force resorts and event planners to rely on artificial snow to guarantee conditions on specific dates. This is the intersection where climate science meets business reality. A resort can survive a volatile winter by opening later, shifting marketing, or leaning on shoulder season tourism. An Olympics cannot shift the dates casually. The schedule is fixed years in advance, athletes train to that schedule, broadcasters build around it, and sponsors pay for predictability. That is why the Olympics become a bellwether for snowmaking dependency. Water conservation policies in the Dolomites are therefore not some separate topic. They sit at the centre of this new winter economy. Snowpack is a natural reservoir. Reduced snowpack means reduced natural water storage for spring and summer, exactly when agriculture, hydropower, ecosystems, and communities need it. Snowmaking competes for water in the same catchments. Even if the water returns later as melt, the system experiences short-term withdrawals and altered timing. Animal life conservation adds another layer. Alpine ecosystems are already compressed by topography. Wildlife corridors run along ridgelines, forests, and valley edges, exactly where infrastructure wants to expand. Species that rely on quiet winter habitat face disturbance from construction, road traffic, night lighting, drones, and off-piste activity. Add a mega event and you get a concentrated pulse of disturbance layered onto a landscape already busy. The Dolomites are home to charismatic fauna that people love to see on postcards and rarely want to share space within reality. Ungulates like chamois and ibex, marmots in summer meadows, raptors like golden eagles, forest species that depend on intact habitat. Predators have been returning to parts of the Alps in recent decades, which brings new management challenges and political heat. Conservation in such a landscape is as much about governance and compliance as it is about ecology. So back to our big question, is the Winter Olympics capable of being net positive once the local environment recovers from mass tourism? Net positive is a brutal standard, and brutal standards are useful because they force clarity. For a Winter Olympics to be net positive, it would need to deliver measurable long-term improvements that exceed the damage and emissions caused by the event and its induced infrastructure. That means not only limiting harm, but generating additional conservation outcomes that would not have happened otherwise. What would that look like in practice? Start with absolute emissions reduction, not only intensity metrics. Travel dominates. A net positive claim would require aggressive transport demand management. Important steps like tickets bundled with rail, capacity limits for private cars, pricing that nudges behaviour, logistics planning that reduces freight miles, and strong incentives for local accommodation rather than distant commuting. If fans fly from across the world, the organiser can purchase offsets, yet offsets do not make the local air cleaner, and they do not cool the mountain. Offsets can fund good projects, yet the credibility problem remains. Then, the Winter Olympics need infrastructure discipline. New build only when there is a genuine community need, with secured post-games utilisation and transparent life cycle analysis. Sliding venues and other specialised builds should pass a harsh test, because history shows that legacy usage is often oversold in bid documents. A net positive standard would also demand strict biodiversity safeguards, habitat restoration commitments, and post-construction monitoring over years, not months. Next comes water accounting that treats alpine catchments as ecosystems. Snowmaking plans would need transparent water sourcing, seasonal limits, ecological flow protection, and investment in efficiency. Reservoir construction would need to avoid sensitive areas and include restoration measures that are meaningful, not decorative. Then there is the governance legacy. This is the sleeper opportunity. A mega event can drive institutional upgrades. Better public transport infrastructure that locals use every day, better building performance standards, better waste and circularity systems and environmental monitoring, along with better enforcement capacity. If the Olympics leave behind stronger institutions and stricter compliance, that can be a real net positive pathway. The final component is the cultural legacy. Winter sport is an influencer industry with skis. Athletes have started speaking openly about glacier retreat and the shrinking of reliable winter conditions. If the Games elevate that message and cut ties with high-carbon sponsorship narratives, the event can shift public opinion and policy pressure. Public opinion can change the policy, sponsorship, and investment choices that determine future warming. Now, for the snowstorm of reality. Most Olympic sustainability claims still look like harm reduction plus marketing. Harm reduction is valuable, yet it does not equal net positive. Net positive is still rare because it requires organisers to accept limits, and limits are the one thing mega events dislike. Limits on growth, spectators, cars, and construction are also limits on profits. So, where does that leave Milano-Cortina and Cortina d'Ampezzo in the UNESCO Dolomites? It leaves them with a mixed ledger. On the positive side, there is visible effort to reuse venues and to frame sustainability as a core element of planning rather than an afterthought. There is investment in building standards and infrastructure frameworks that can improve long-term performance. There are transport measures and traffic restrictions aimed at reducing congestion and emissions. There is talk of data, measurement, and disclosure. On the negative side, the dependence on artificial snow is a giant red flag for water and energy, even with efficiency measures. In sensitive alpine environments, reservoirs and pumping systems reshape hydrology and land use. Construction impacts for controversial venues raise the risk of long-tail damage for short-term gain. Cost overruns and last-minute delivery pressures historically correlate with environmental shortcuts, because rushed projects rarely produce gentle outcomes. A Winter Olympics can be made less damaging than the worst editions of the past, and be made better than a typical mass tourism surge in some respects, particularly if it forces upgrades in public transport, building efficiency, and governance that the region would not have funded otherwise. It can also raise climate awareness at global scale through athletes and media attention. Yet, our standard of net positive is a much higher bar. Net positive requires organisers to accept that the event must fit within ecological limits, not simply manage impacts within a growth model. Net positive also requires transparent long-term monitoring and accountability, because without follow-through, legacy becomes a word that means stadiums and ribbon cuttings. So, can the Winter Olympics become a net positive mega event? Yes, in theory, through strict reuse, deep mobility reforms, hard biodiversity safeguards, and durable governance upgrades that outlast the Games. Will it be net positive in practice? The evidence to date suggests a more familiar outcome. Meaningful improvements around the edges, paired with a core model that still depends on huge travel emissions and manufactured winter conditions, all delivered under a deadline that rewards speed and spectacle. That is not a moral judgment on our part. It is a systems diagnosis. Mega events want scale, while alpine ecosystems want restraint. We will have to wait another 4 years to see whether the next iterations of the Winter Olympics in the French Alps will choose restraint as a design constraint rather than a public relations theme. Well, that's a wrap on our 60th GreenWave podcast episode. All our listeners know we appreciate you sharing your time. Find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeart, Podchaser, Boomplay, and Player FM. Follow us, the pod, and share with friends. We'd love if you would leave a review. If you have missed any of our LinkedIn posts or the GreenWave Gazette, you can always catch us on LinkedIn, X, Facebook, Instagram, or visit synergy-international.net. We'll keep reflecting on the trends shaping sustainable finance and global policy. Until next time, keep riding the green wave of sustainability